So Gertrude Stein once said of Oakland that there is no there there. A powerful sentiment born of a feeling of displacement and loss when she returned to her childhood home decades later to find a city she didn't recognize or associate with the small town she had once known. There is a fitting title for Tommy Orange's incredible debut novel, where a large cast of characters grapple with what it means to be Native American in 21st century America, and on top of that, what it means if you're an urban Indian who knows the sounds of the freeway better than rivers. Orange brings Oakland to life through these many-faceted and wholly human characters, offering readers a new perspective on Native American life and on a previously unseen part of Oakland. Orange is a powerful new voice on the American literary scene, and we're thrilled to have him here at P&P tonight for the first of what will hopefully be many book tours. So please join me in welcoming Tommy Orange.
I'm going to read a little bit and maybe open up for questions, and then I'll have more to read if there's time or if you all seem like you want it. But even for my favorite writers, I never like to sit and listen to anybody read. Not for too long. You want to hear some of it. But so I'm just going to read a little bit first from the prologue and then a little bit from another chapter. So this is from the prologue. How many people have read this already? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for reading it. I still feel like indebted to anyone who's put their time in to read the whole book. That's like your time, and you spent it to read something that I wrote. I appreciate it. I really do. Urbanity. Urban Indians were the generation born in the city. We've been moving for a long time, but the land moves with you like memory. An urban Indian belongs to the city, and cities belong to the earth. Everything here is formed in relation to every other living and non-living thing from the earth. All our relations. The process that brings anything to its current form, chemical, synthetic, technological, or otherwise, doesn't make the product not a product of the living earth. Buildings, cars, freeways, are these not of the earth? Were they shipped in from Mars, the moon? Is it because they're processed, manufactured, or that we handle them? Are we so different? Were we at one time not something else entirely? Homo sapiens, single-celled organisms, space dust, unidentifiable pre-bang quantum theory? Cities form in the same way as galaxies. Urban Indians feel at home walking in the shadow of a downtown building. We came to know the downtown Oakland skyline better than we did any sacred mountain range. The redwoods in the Oakland Hills better than any other deep wild forest. We know the sound of the freeway better than we do rivers, the howl of distant trains better than wolf howls. We know the smell of gas and freshly wet concrete and burned rubber better than we do the smell of cedar or sage or even fry bread, which isn't traditional, like reservations aren't traditional. But nothing is original. Everything comes from something that came before, which was once nothing. Everything is new and doomed. We ride buses, trains, and cars across over and under concrete plains. Being Indian has never been about returning to the land. The land is everywhere or nowhere. This is from a chapter that appeared in the New Yorker as a story called The State. And in the novel, it's called Thomas Frank. My actual name is Thomas Frank Orange. I sort of openly wrote this as this character isn't me. It wasn't baldly autobiographical, but it's based on my life in many ways. And the New Yorker editor, Deborah Treisman, had me change the title of the story that they wanted to publish in the New Yorker, because Thomas Frank is some kind of respected journalist. I've never heard of him, but so The State is was, if you've read it or if you've heard of it, that was the name of it within that context. But it's called Thomas Frank in the novel, and I'm just going to read a little bit here. Thomas Frank. How many people here have read or heard this story? Okay, less people than that. Okay, good. Before you were born, you were a head and a tail in a milky pool, a swimmer. You were a race, a dying off, a breaking through, an arrival. Before you were born, you were an egg, and your mom who was an egg and her mom. Before you were born, you were the nested Russian grandmother doll of possibility in your mom's ovaries. You were two halves of 1,000 different kinds of possibilities, a million heads or tails, flip shine on a spun coin. Before you were born, you were the idea to make it to California for gold or bust. You were white, you were brown, you were red, you were dust. You were hiding, you were seeking. Before you were born, you were chased, beaten, broken, trapped on a reservation in Oklahoma. Before you were born, you were an idea your mom got into her head in the 70s to hitchhike across the country and become a dancer in New York. You were on your way when she did not make it across the country, but sputtered and spiraled and wound up in Taos, New Mexico, at a peyote commune named Morning Store. Before you were born, you were your dad's decision to move away from the reservation up to northern New Mexico to learn about a Pueblo guy's fireplace. You were the light in the wet of your parents' eyes as they met across that fireplace in ceremony. Before you were born, your halves inside them moved to Oakland. Before you were born, before your body was much more than heart, spine, bone, brain, skin, blood, and vein, when you just started to build muscle with movement. Before you showed, bulged in her belly, as her belly. Before your dad's pride could belly swell from the sight of you, your parents were in a room listening to the sound your heart made. You had an arrhythmic heartbeat. The doctor said it was normal. Your arrhythmic heart was not abnormal. Maybe he's a drummer, your dad said. He doesn't even know what a drum is, your mom said. Heart, your dad said. The man said arrhythmic. That means no rhythm. Maybe it just means he knows the rhythm so good he doesn't always hit it when you expect him to. Rhythm of what? She said. But once you got big enough to make your mom feel you, she couldn't deny it. You swam to the beat. When your dad brought out the kettle drum, you'd kick her in time with it, or to her heartbeat, or to one of the oldies mixtapes she'd made from records she loved and played to no end in your Aerostar minivan. Once you were out in the world, running and jumping and climbing, you tapped your toes and fingers everywhere. All the time. On tabletops, desktops. You tapped every surface you found in front of you. Listened for the sound things made back at you when you hit them. The timbre of taps, the din of dings, silverware clings on kitchens, in kitchens, door knocks, knuckle cracks, head scratches. You were finding out that everything makes a sound. Everything can be drumming, whether rhythm is kept or strays. Even gunshots and backfire, the howl of trains at night, the wind against your windows. The world is made of sound. But inside every kind of sound lurked a sadness. In the quiet between your parents after a fight, they both managed to lose. You and your sisters listening through the walls for tones, listening for early signs of a fight, for late signs of a fight reignited. The sound of the worship service, that building drone and wail of evangelical Christian worship, your mom speaking in tongues on the crest of that weekly Sunday wave, sadness because you couldn't feel any of it in there and wanted to, felt you needed it, that it could protect you from the dreams you had almost every night about the end of the world and the possibility of hell forever, you living there still a boy, unable to die or leave or do anything but burn in a lake of fire. Sadness came when you had to wake up your snoring dad in church, even as members of the congregation, members of your own family, were being slain by the Holy Ghost in the aisles right next to him. Sadness came when the days got shorter at the end of summer, when the street got quiet without kids out anymore. In the color of that fleeting sky, sadness lurked, sadness pounced, slid in between everything, anything it could find its way into, through sound, through you. You didn't think of any of the tapping or knocking as drumming until you actually started drumming many years later. It would have been good to know that you'd always done something naturally. But there was too much going on with everyone else in your family for anyone to notice. You probably should have done something else with your fingers and toes than tap, with your mind and time than knock at all the surfaces in your life, like you were looking for a way in. Thank you. So, that was just a section from the prologue and from another chapter way later into the novel. And there's another section I could read, but I think less is more with these things. And if you all have questions, we can do that now.
Thank you. So I have to admit, I've read more about your book than I've actually read your book, but I did read the prologue while I was sitting here, and I wanted to ask you about that. Why start the book that way? What function does that prologue serve for you, for the reader going into your novel? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wait, say it.
Yeah.
What did it serve for you?
Say again?
What did it serve for you?
Well, since I haven't read the rest of the book, I'm not sure, right?
No, but I mean, what did this prologue do?
So, it's a terrible history, right? You're contextualizing the book in the context of some horrible ways in which, Native American images and bodies and, peoples have been subjugated throughout history in different ways. So, it's kind of a, maybe not surprising, but really awful kind of setup for the book. And I guess the obvious answer is, well, there's this, right? This is part of the context of understanding this whole story, right? Which is kind of about, it seems, the ways in which, Native Americans of your generation, experience their own sort of cultural history, right? As they're taught and brought up and the stories they hear, but in a world far removed from all of that in some ways, right? Growing up in Oakland, experiencing being a Native American in a very different way. So that's my first thought.
Cool,
on
thank
that.
you. No, I just wanted to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So my dad was pretty reticent as a man growing up. He was an engineer, worked at the Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And, sometimes when we think about culture and passing on things in modern settings, the idea of this stuff just gets transmitted effortlessly because to act like there's no effort and there's not a privilege to make it effortless, to pass on, to have the time and energy and the effort when you're working class to pass things on. So my dad, the one story we got was, and this shows up in the prologue, was this massacre story, the Sangh Creek Massacre. Mm-hmm. And it's a horrific story. My dad told it. This is the only story he told multiple times. He told other stories that were weird, and we didn't know what to make of them. To do with owls throwing rocks at him and his cousins. But he told this one multiple times because his name origin came from how we survived as a family. Our ancestors survived because this young boy saved this baby, and this was our ancestor. This is the Sangh Creek Massacre. So we heard this story, probably the only story, this Sangh Creek Massacre story, that he heard his great-grandparents tell him who they'd heard. You know, it was an important story, even though it's horrific. And so, like, my book in some ways, like, it's harrowing. It's, in some ways, it maybe is horrific. But I believe in looking back wide-eyed and not squinting purposefully because it's too brightly horrible. Yeah. And so I grew up with this one story, and we would go back and visit our family back in Oklahoma, but you know, some of the history that gets transmitted is just like the look in one of your parents' eyes and what they've been through, and like it's maybe not as tangible as an actual story or an actual piece of history, or it's not an object, which we tend to like, you know, make more valuable than other things. But I would just lie down with my dad in front of the TV and look into his eyes and be devastated by what I found there. And I write now, like most of the writing that I do on the ground, like lying down. Related to I don't know what. Like it's mysterious to me too. But I think I strayed a little bit from your question.
No, not really, because what I was thinking of was, I mean, you know, you start with the image of that, you know, that sign off, right, on television, you know, and you even reference, you know, the crying Indian, and, you know, in one way you're saying we're surrounded by all of these images of natives, right? But on another level, we don't know, and you and by we, I mean anyone, like your own people included, you know, you're like, you were, there's a line in there that says something like, you know, easily internetable, you know, look up facts, right? Things that people don't search very deeply. Yeah. You know, in some sense, they're surrounded by all of this information about Native Americans, right? Mm-hmm. But on another level, they don't know anything about it. Yeah. You know, not even beyond the most superficial level, right? Yeah. We've got mascots and, you know, these kinds of things, right?
Well, and I think my decision to write this kind of prologue was related to, and this is, you know, across the board in regards to people who have been oppressed and history that's been rewritten and written purposely wrong. Mm-hmm. I wasn't writing it for non-Native people. I was trying to write it in an interesting way for Native people to like really like assess like what this bit has been in an interesting way, because in the age of fake news and the age of information, both sort of happening at the same time, fiction and art in general play a really important role to make the truth compelling enough. Like, it's not about information anymore. It's about how do you make something like real and the truth without having to have the interface of fact. Like, how do you cut through all of the nonsense that is now? And so I was trying to do that with this prologue.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So my dad, officially, this is a whole language thing and a code talking within Native people. So officially, let's start from the top. I'm enrolled in the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, right? And there's a lot of layers here. So officially, I have a certificate degree of Indian blood. And on that degree, which is an official degree, I am 1/4 Cheyenne or Indian blood. It's not tribe specific. I'm actually half, but I'll stop there for a second. My dad is basically full blood, but his dad did not accept him as a son. He was a product of an extramarital affair, and everyone in the small town he grew up in knew that who his dad was. but he was also a 32nd German and a 16th Sioux. So I'm technically 3/64 short of a half. And I know this, and he told me this. He's an engineer. He's very into math. So on my dad's side, like, there's all this, and it becomes really heartbreaking because my son, because we have a quarter blood quantum requirement to be enrolled in our tribe, my son, because we're 3/64 short, cannot enroll in our tribe. Even though I'm like basically half minus that 3/64. What even is that? So my son currently cannot enroll in our tribe, and how that's going to play out in his identity when he becomes like 18, like, I don't know. So anyway, my dad grew up with his great grandparents raised him up, and he speaks an old dialect of Cheyenne. He didn't even see a white person until he was 5 years old, or speak English until he got into school in the first grade. Like, that's his background. And my mom is white, and we go 3 generations back in Oakland, and her ancestors came over from France, and we're like a mix of different things from Europe. But so my background is, being in Oakland, it was not as complicated because Oakland's very biracial if you're in certain parts of it, if you grew up in certain parts of it. So I grew up on a block with 6 different families with kids my age who were all biracial, different kinds of biracial. And so, I don't know, my background is that's as much as I can explain as far as how much we have time for right now. It's just a skate company out of Oakland. Illuminati.
I was going to ask, one of the things I loved in the book was there were so many personal and then so many collective stories, like a collective history as well. And the younger characters in the book, I feel like were really searching in a lot of ways for their identity. And I feel like some of the older characters didn't share as much of their heritage because it was such a heavy weight for them that they didn't necessarily want to put that weight on their children or their grandchildren. Where do you think there's like a balance between that and I don't know, like, where do you think the answer is for the kids in this story? Like, what they're searching for, do you think they're going to find it?
Well, I think the hesitancy to relay the information or share it or want to pass it on is definitely related to my dad. And, he grew up in a small town where he wasn't accepted as being part of a family that he was a part of. And so he just came from a ton of pain. And culture being transmitted to your children, if it comes from pain, he wanted to start over in the city. And so it's complicated. And I wanted to express that in the characters. But like the younger characters, like, we want to know because we feel it. Like, we feel it in a way that's not tarnished or tainted, or pain has not influenced it as much. I mean, a parent's, transmitted pain does do a certain amount, but does not destroy curiosity. And so I just wanted to express the complexity of like the way things get passed on. And, there's certain like American families who like proudly pass on this lie of like pride, like, this is what we come from, like, sort of like, let's flex our fake truth of what this country is. And while Native people are ashamed because it comes from pain to pass on to their children, because it's too like it hurts too much to try to tell your children because you don't want to give them the pain. So you have this inverse quality of dominant American white families with white supremacy as a basis proudly passing on a heritage, and another who's been damaged so much by this side that they don't even want to share it. And this is how erasure happens within culture and within families, and how history gets rewritten in a deeper way than just the history textbooks, which is a whole nother subject. This is just within families, like how things get erased. You just don't even want to revisit what happened because you don't want to pass pain on to your children. And if your personal history and your family history is pain, you don't want to give that to your children, then it's erased. And that's doing part of the work of. I used to be more precious, and when I had a kid, I realized, like, whatever time I can get. I read a lot of in my son's room on the floor, like around his toys, like I said before, because my dad. I just write on my stomach, like elbows propped. It's very bad for my back and neck. No, it's all computer. I didn't even start writing until the era of laptops and computers, and so I don't have whatever chance I get is my writing style, and I used to be a lot more precious around what my requirements were, and it just became different when I became a parent. He's from Hammond, Oklahoma. Hammond, Oklahoma. It's probably like 2 hours from Oklahoma City. And we have Sundance, and we have. My sister just had a sweat for me and my family before we went out on the book tour. I mean, in the civil rights, like the AIM movement, the American Indian movement was big. It happened in Oakland, and the taking over this prison island was pretty insane. Like, the more you think about it now, I don't know about Mecca. I don't know about, the community's pretty modest. When you think about the population of Native people in the country, it's relatively small. And when you think about the reason why, it's pretty bleak. Like, it's like if we were in a town of 1,000, we're like 200 people. That's the sort of relative size of Native people in the country. And that's part of why we're invisible. But we're invisible because you can imagine, or you should be able to imagine. I mean, I would focus on certain aspects of the way I talk about alcoholism and suicide within certain chapters, which is one specifically where Jackie Redfeather, she's at this conference and is talking about how the way we treat suicide is like kids are burning inside a building and they're jumping out and dying from the fall. And the idea is that the way we treat that is like we want them to burn inside the house, and we're trying to find ways for them to not jump out and to stay burning instead of addressing the burning that's happening within the house. And the alcoholism being the way I address it in the novel is there's nothing special about Native people's relationship to alcohol. It's legal and it's cheap and it's nearby because they build liquor stores right where they think they can profit the most. And that's true in a lot of different oppressed people's communities. So to demystify this idea that there's a special relationship to suicide or alcohol and look at the deeper roots of why people are miserable and would rather die than be here, like to look at the deeper roots in history and in the ways that we think about people and in the white supremacy that continues to rule in this country, especially under this administration. I think to focus on that stuff instead of the specifics related to alcohol or suicide is the more strength-based approach to thinking about the problems, because the problems get put on the people who are oppressed and are just trying to survive. But the realities of the people in power and what they're doing is the thing that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. When you were getting published or trying to get published, did you find like the literature world having a definition of what a Native author was and try to make you fit it? Or did you feel that they gave you the leeway because they didn't know what a Native author was and let you sort of define it?
I have a hard time trying to tell other writers how it happened for me, because I feel very lucky about the way it happened. I gave a reading at a writing conference, and a writer heard me and loved what I read and sent my stuff actually like right after Trump was elected. Her and her husband sort of took it as a call to action, and they both sent it out to their agents, my manuscript at the time. And her agent, like 3 days later, was up at 4 a.m. with anxiety and felt like she got some hope from my manuscript. And it wasn't necessarily related to, can I market this as a Native this or not? It was like on the merit of the work itself. She loved it, and she, my agent was a big part of why it got out the way it did. So there wasn't ever any like ambiguity or confusion. There was a lot of like love and acceptance for what I did from an early state, and I'm very lucky for that, because I know it can be really hard.
So I grew up in Oklahoma. I'm a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit about your dad, but my mom's side of the family is Muskogee Creek, and just by nature of history, my grandparents didn't want to tell stories and share with my great-grandparents didn't want to share with my grandparents, and that led to, my mom not growing up knowing a whole lot about our history. And so I guess what I'm asking, because for me, I didn't really learn about a lot of the truth until I was an adult and learned it myself. I'm wondering if you can share what that process was like for you, becoming an adult and starting to learn things on your own, and if that influenced your writing or anything like that.
I just had a conversation with my dad like 2 hours before I came here, and he was, he's getting older, and he was talking about being at the casino, and he gambles, and there's this woman that he always said he always remembered being behind him, sort of cheering him on, and he said just last week she had just like sort of said some kind of encouragement about him being on some kind of streak, and she dropped dead in the middle of the casino. And he told me, it was this heartbreaking statement that he told me. He was like, sometimes I think that's the way I'm going to go. And in the context of this conversation of him thinking about this stuff, he's been trying to tell me for the first time ever, because he didn't grow up telling us very much. He told us about a massacre. He told us like sort of spooky stories about owls throwing rocks at him and his friends. He wants to tell me things, and I've been doing interviews with him for the past 4 months. And I got an app that can record our conversations, but he's like so open and wanting to share certain things now. Has to do with like maybe the idea of being gone, or so I'm open to it now, and really wanting it, because I wanted it the whole time, but he was just he was a reticent man, and he was a harsh man, and he had a temper. So it's hard to approach a parent who has all those qualities to try to ask for stories. So the fact that he's doing it now openly and wanting it, I'm moving toward him in the same way. Does that answer your question?
No? Oh, okay. So I was raised on the reservation. I'm over here. I can't stand. I'm sorry. I have so many books in my lap. I was raised on the reservation and then moved off to Los Angeles. So I got like the urban experience, and I can semi-identify with you on the part of being involved in an urban community. And I appreciate the fact that you wrote about it. Do you see the urban community in your area or any other areas being able to remedy the fact that there's this disconnect between members who are away from the reservation or away from their culture and people who are still involved in their culture? And if you do see some type of remedy, how would you like to see that influence your writing?
What do you mean by remedy?
I know in the LA community, we would have different types of like community events. Like we had different powwows every year. And then once we started getting enough people from one tribe, like all the tribes would get together. Like for my tribe in particular, we would have a meetup every month, where we exchanged like stories and food and language. And that type of ability to teach our culture was available. But I wasn't sure if you had seen anything in Oakland or any other communities where there's type of a connectedness.
I mean, there are certain tribes that, because of the size of the tribe, that are always like a sort of stronger base, like Lakotas in Oakland seems to be a thing. Navajos are a big tribe, and so that's a more common thing. But the thing about urban Indian communities, because of the history of relocation since the 1950s and 60s, you have all these different tribes coming from reservations and settling in cities and starting families, and then the children of those people and the children's children of those people tend to be mixed communities. So it's sort of an intertribal base as far as urban Indian identity goes. And so that's part of why I wanted the novel to end and to be based around a powwow, because powwows are powwows are intertribal. And so you have a lot of different tribes coming together. That's just natural to powwows, but it's also natural to urban Indian communities. You have people coming from a lot of different tribes. You have people that within their own families are a lot of different tribes. So remedies, I don't know. This is part of the struggle. Like, tribal people want tribal sovereignty and individual qualities acknowledged and particulars acknowledged, and not to become a part of pan-Indianism. Urban Indian, pan-Indian, people that come from a lot of different tribes within their own families want to be accepted as Indian regardless of not having one base tribe or language. It's not happening that well as far as we're all part of one thing, because the pan-Indian and the individual tribe thing does not mesh well. But it's something that has to be worked out, and I don't know what the answer is. But it's a conversation we have to start having, because if we don't have it and it becomes it's just like the blood quantum problem. If we don't have it, it just leads to destructive erasure.
Thank you very much. I'm of a generation that learned essentially white's good, native peoples or Indians bad. And that's what the history I was taught in school. And it was no matter what the native peoples did, they were just painted with a brush of savages, awful things, and doing these terrible things to the white settlers as they moved out. And it wasn't until I read Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee, and I was literally blown away. I could not believe that what I was taught was so diametrically opposed to what the truth was. And I wonder, you mentioned the hiding of the feelings that some of the people, especially the older people, do. And I'm sure that has something to do with being painted in that way as a terrible group of people who were awful and killing all the whites and, nothing about what the whites were doing. And I know there's more writers and others speaking out, but do you feel like that you're making as a people enough progress to erase those lies? Because that's what I was taught, it was all a lie, fake news, fake history.
Well, I can't speak on behalf of all Native people. To do enough, feels very difficult to try to say with any certainty, given this current administration. Donald Trump just said, we tamed this continent or country, and we're not going to apologize for America. A lot of histories are still being written wrong. It feels a little bit, and I don't mean to offend you, but within your question, putting the burden on us to are we doing enough? It feels more like, are you doing enough? No offense intended, but it feels sometimes like that side of privilege feels like it's the burden's on you, and the burden shouldn't be. White people in white history, you should not feel good about being shitty and acting out on the privilege that is whiteness. You should not want to be a part of something that's shitty. That's on you though. We'll do what we can do, but the burden is definitely not on us. Well, it is on us.
Thank you. My name is Christy Johnson. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation, so thank you for coming here. But I know that you mentioned earlier that you initially wrote the prologue initially just to have that, to capture I guess you say, you wrote the book in a way to kind of write for the Native perspective or the audience. What were you hoping to capture with that? When somebody like me or somebody else who is Native, what was your intent with that?
In regards to writing for a Native audience? Yeah. So, especially with the prologue, because I didn't want to hit other Native people over the head with the same thing we already know, because the prologue is very much Native people know this. So I wrote really hard into trying to make it as interesting and as intricate as I could to make it feel like it was new, even though it's information we might already know. Mm-hmm. So I wrote into it that way, and then the characters that I wrote and the stories that I wrote, as I was writing it, I thought this is stuff that Native people will connect to, and I never expected it to be outside of that. So everything that's happened outside of that has been crazy. But I definitely wrote into a community that I knew and was a part of and wanted to connect to, because, I didn't see any books out there that did what I did. And one of the functions of literature that I love is to make you feel less alone. when you read something very intimate and particular, to make you feel like, oh, there's other people out there like me. Because loneliness is a terrible feeling to feel like, and for Native people, that can be a really hard one to deal with.
Could you tell us about the process of editing your book, like how you found your editor, who the editor was, if it was a Native person or non-Native person, and whether you intentionally looked or didn't look for a Native editor, and how your publishers reacted to the process of editing your book?
So I consider the heaviest load of editing was what I did. And that was a 6-year process of writing and editing. Once it went out and I got an agent and it went out to a lot of different publishers. Once I decided on my editor and publisher, I was very careful about the way it was, the language of what was being asked to change. But I felt, and this has been like very different from sort of the sharing with audiences and the questions that have come up in audiences. The editor experience was very craft level based. Like whatever edits I felt like I got on a line level and sort of like a structure level, there was nothing that was like culturally, I felt like was invasive or problematic to me. So that process was pretty smooth and I was super happy with my editor. There's some copy editor stuff, and most of all, the book cover process was very messy. At one point, they just wanted to put a headdress on the front. Yeah, it was. So my experience with the editing team and the copy editing team and everything was relatively okay. I had an agent who put it. There was a lot of publishers that wanted it, and I wanted it to be a book that had reach, and so the publishing world is very white and mostly women, and my editor's a white woman, and I didn't have any problem with that. I met with her and I really liked her, so the publishing world is super white.
So in the writing process, did the idea that your finished product would pass into the hands of not only just non-Native readers, but readers with all sorts of like preconceived ideas of what Native communities are like, did that ever constrain your own creative process?
No, I didn't consider audience very much at all. I was very much, I read my stuff aloud a lot in private, and I had an app that has robot voices that reads to me, like do dishes or go for runs, and then give me a new perspective on revisions. And I was mostly about finding what I felt to be true to the voices that I intended. I really don't give that much consideration when I'm writing to like, I'm not trying to sound righteous. Like, that's just not the way I write. Like, I have a vision for something and I try to get it to a good place.
I finished your book yesterday. And just as I was getting done, some neighbors of mine came by, and I said, "Oh man, I just finished this book. It's about Native people living in Oakland, and Alcatraz and AIM, and these kids growing up, urban Indians. Their eyes are glazing over, and they have no idea what I'm talking about." It's been interesting to hear you say that you wanted this book to be something that Native people could relate to, and I think they can. You cover like every issue. I think Native people are facing these days. The suicide, there were even some things about kids in situations like they're facing on the border today. I was, writing these notes down, women being kidnapped. And I thought, this is a book that should be read by more people. How do you, and you were just saying, like, I don't write for an audience, but I think more people should read this. And how do you expand the audience? The conversation. How do you expand the conversation? I mean, we're doing it tonight, but it's important stuff.
Yeah, no, I respect that you're saying that. It's not really something that I can do. I'm at Penguin Random House, and they have a big reach and a big marketing team. So there's a lot they're doing. The independent booksellers have been huge supporters before the book came out. There's been amazing love from that sector. There's been a great librarian love. How much I can do, I try to be a private person, and I'm not big on social media. I'm not sure what you're asking of me. Yeah, I want to keep writing. I mean, that's something that's been great about the whole thing, is that I can write for a living now. It's really, I'm very grateful for that. I just realized today that the District of Columbia is related to Columbus, and that like the nation's capital is related to Columbus, who was one of the worst men in history, who founded this country. He was an awful person. Anyone can look into the history. And so we still, for my book launch, I was staying in a hotel in Manhattan, and there's a giant, in Columbus Circle in Manhattan, I didn't know this existed, there's a giant statue of Columbus, he's lifted 30 feet high. It was directed straight at the hotel when I came out, and it just felt like it just, I don't know. There's a lot of institutional and systematic evils that we aren't willing to look at as a country, and my whole book was launched directly related to Trump getting in. My last name's Orange. He's an orange president. It's been crazy. A chapter of the book got published in the New Yorker, and on the front cover of that New Yorker issue was a naked Trump on the front, in front of a podium. There's just been a lot of weird connections. Definitely will never thank him for anything, but one overall thing, which is, he's forced us to look at something really ugly, and otherwise we may have been complacent to it. And he is the ugliness that a lot of people already knew about, and is forcing us to address it in a very serious way, and sort of asking people to choose sides, or at least think about it in a more serious way. Obviously, it would be better if he did not exist. Thank you.